Welcome back to the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast. In our last episode, we spent some time talking about imposter syndrome, the what, the why, and the how. Now, if you haven't listened to it, please go and do so, as it's packed with useful information about what imposter syndrome really is, how it works, and actionable strategies for overcoming it. Now, as someone who focuses on this subject as a big part of my work, there's something that really bothers me about what you see online about imposter syndrome, and that is the amount of misinformation. I mean, I actually saw someone on LinkedIn call it fake news the other day, Cece, and so I almost spat my coffee out. I mean, what the dickens? So with that in mind, Cece and I decided that we should do an episode to unpack some of the misconceptions you may have read or heard about imposter syndrome, because we wanted to set the record straight as two people who publicly and passionately speak about this topic. And then we realized that actually the best person to do this with us would be the world-leading expert on the subject. So today we're delighted to bring on a very special guest, author, global thought leader, Imposter Syndrome Institute co-founder and expert, Dr. Valerie Young. Welcome, Valerie. We're absolutely delighted and honored to have you on the podcast with us today.
I'm thrilled to be here, mate.
Thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. So, Valerie, you've been in the field of imposter syndrome for a long time and conducted extensive research on the topic. You've written a book, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women and Men, Why Capable People Suffer from Imposter Syndrome and How to Thrive in Spite of It, which has now been published in 8 languages, including Turkish. You co-founded the Imposter Syndrome Institute and developed the Rethinking Imposter Syndrome program that's been delivered to over 500,000 people globally, including places like Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, JP Morgan, Google, and NASA. So you know your stuff. And despite all of your amazing work and the time you spent training other people like myself to truly educate on what imposter syndrome really is and the impact of these unresolved negative feelings, there are still a lot of people out there in the world spouting many misconceptions that contradict your work and the work of Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who originally discovered the phenomenon. Things like it's your superpower, we should embrace it, and it's your secret to success. So, Valerie, what are your thoughts on these various myths, and how can we adequately debunk them here today?
Yeah, I'm so happy to talk on this topic, honestly, because it's really only, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years, Rachel and Cece, where there has been this kind of very pervasive misinformation and also just kind of some very inaccurate and incomplete, let me say incomplete narratives. So one of them is the one that you're talking about. They're kind of competing narratives on the one hand. So one of them is that it's a good thing. It's our superpower. It's a badge of honor because it means we're successful. And some of that comes from Adam Grant's work. He's a Wharton organizational psychologist, Wharton professor, wrote a book called Think Again, talked about it in his book. But other very, prominent people have jumped on the bandwagon of saying, we should embrace our imposter syndrome. Often the case that they make is that it motivates us to work harder. That's one of the things they say. Well, number one, the research shows that women are less propelled by self-doubt. Mm-hmm. So that might motivate some people, but a whole other group of people pull back. They have the opposite response. Mm. And there seems to be this collective mindset that it's a good thing because it's all about, effort and working hard. And they forget there's a whole category of people for whom the absolute opposite happens, who pull back, who drop out, who opt out, who don't grow their business or start their business or, whatever it might be. The other, the reason they say it's a good thing is that it means we're learning and growing. Mm-hmm. And my response is, are you really saying we have to feel inadequate? We have to feel like frauds to be learning? And I don't think so. Mm-hmm. The third big reason they say that it's a good thing is that it keeps us humble. And I've been doing this for 4 decades. I have yet to hear a single woman say, I think I'm going to keep my self-doubt and my lack of confidence because it keeps me humble. Right? I think hubris is more of a male issue. And I mention that because it really wasn't until more men entered into a conversation that had been historically pretty much a female conversation on imposter syndrome that rebranding happened. that it got flipped into a positive. And you see that with a lot of things societally. Suddenly, again, it gets kind of rebranded. I really recommend, an alternative choice, that this false narrative that you can either be an arrogant jerk or you can keep your imposter syndrome, I think is a false choice. And I recommend a healthier choice, a third choice, which is to become what I call a humble realist. Somebody who is genuinely humble, but has never had imposter feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it? All of those narratives. And the other one is that it's fake news, that it doesn't exist. And we need to stop telling people that, or women specifically, that they have imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I think they're often kind of melded, but some folks in the fake news camp, I think most people, because they're getting their information from the internet and they're getting it based on the terminology of imposter syndrome. If they were to Google imposter phenomenon, it is a heavily researched topic. There are hundreds of studies. It was just a study with dental students in Saudi Arabia that found equal rates amongst men and women in Saudi Arabia, slightly higher with men, medical students in Malaysia. But there's research done on marketing managers and business people and doctoral students and Black doctoral students, very kind of specific niches and groups. So it's very heavily researched. So this idea that it's kind of this made up kind of thing is it's just a lack of information, a lack of awareness. The other piece around stop telling women they have imposter syndrome, for folks who don't know, there was a Harvard Business Review article that came out maybe 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago now. And I agree, they're absolutely right. Nobody should be telling anyone they have imposter syndrome. It's no one's place we shouldn't be quote unquote diagnosing anyone. And by the way, it's not, nor has it ever been, a diagnosable psychological condition of any sort.
Broken.
Say it again.
You're not broken.
No, exactly. You're not broken. I continue to use imposter syndrome. I was recently asked to contribute to a book being published by the American Psychological Association. I'm the only non-academic and the only non-psychologist who was asked to participate. And they asked me to change the title and change my language to say imposter phenomena instead of imposter syndrome.
Right.
Because in the world of psychology, a syndrome is a diagnosis. It's a psychological condition. I use it based on, my frame of reference is not this diagnostic statistical manual, which is what they use. My frame of reference is the dictionary. And the dictionary, the second definition of the dictionary is a syndrome is a set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that constitute a pattern. Perfectly describes imposter syndrome. So my point is, I agree we shouldn't be telling anybody anything. But at the same time, to me, it's a little patronizing to suggest that people are putting ideas into women's heads. Like, we're just filling your silly little heads with this imposter nonsense, and that we're too, I don't know, naive to parse it out for ourselves, or that we don't know that there's a societal aspect to it. I mean, women understand there's a societal aspect to it, which is where I also very much agree with them. Anybody who's out there coaching or speaking on imposter syndrome who is not addressing the systemic bias element of imposter syndrome, I think is negligent. So to me, the fact that it was one of the top 100 read articles for Harvard Business Review speaks to a hunger I think people have for a more societal analysis of this topic. I mean, I brought that to the topic for 40 years, but it's not, clearly it came as a surprise to a lot of people.
That's really interesting. And I'll tell you why. Think about, I'm just reflecting on my own workplace and all the workplace experiences I've had. And we don't talk about this at all. This is not, a topic that is ever covered in a curriculum, with the exception for the program that I run. But it really isn't any conversation happening around this at all. And I think when you let this idea and these feelings perpetuate, it only makes the problem bigger and worse. And I think you have to be, I love what you said about being a humble realist. I like to think of myself as a humble realist. I think you have to really, you have to talk about it and give people a place where they can talk about it. And it's okay to admit, hey, I'm not perfect in everything, but I try and I work really hard. And because of that, I've attained the level of success that I have,
Yeah,
being
absolutely.
humble and also a realist.
You're absolutely right. It has to be talked about. One of the tools I teach is to normalize imposter syndrome. And it means a few things, but one of them is to kind of break the silence, name it on the organizational level. I read about a company in their job posting at the bottom. They said, we understand imposter syndrome and the confidence gap are real. We want you to apply. So the more managers can talk about it in an offhanded, casual, kind of informative kind of way, it gives other people permission to talk about these normal feelings. The other way to normalize, going back to that article, because there is a systemic element to it based on around racism and sexism, but also, folks with disabilities, people working or studying in a language that is not their first language, first generation professionals. Whenever you're on the receiving end of stereotypes about competence or intelligence, I mean, we all know what it's like to feel underestimated. We're the youngest person in a work environment, or maybe the oldest, right? And when I asked that question to Facebook employees, how many of you have ever felt underestimated because you were the oldest? Like the 30-year-olds raised their hand. So you have to look at the systemic aspects. At the same time, like that article only focused on systemic bias. And so it left out the fact that people in STEM fields are more susceptible for different reasons. Students, especially graduate students, for even still another reason, or people in creative fields. Sometimes organizational culture, completely unrelated to bias, is the main source. And there's also family messaging. So we have to look at all of the different factors and understand them. So when you have a normal imposter moment, you can kind of hit the pause button, zoom out, get the bigger picture from 20,000 feet, and do less personalizing and more contextualizing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Cece, as a woman of color, you may have experienced some unconscious and societal biases in and around that yourself. Can you talk to that and kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. Yeah, actually, and I was thinking about this, Valerie, as you were speaking, but this instance happened, I want to say I'm going back 10 years ago now, but I was having a lunch meeting with my boss, who was a white male, and I was in the role for a couple of months, and he made a comment. He said, "Oh, when I thought about hiring you, my assumption is that you're very demure and that you don't say a lot." So I was a little concerned. That was my first concern, that you are more demure, that maybe you weren't as vocal. And now that you're in the role, I can see I was completely
Now we can't shut you up.
Yes, in a very good way.
I'm kidding.
I managed to prove myself in a very favorable way in that role. But his comment to me caught me off guard, because no one had ever, if they thought it, they never admitted it to my face. And my instinct was, wow, it's really interesting, the assumptions you make about people without even knowing them, and how if he had trusted his gut instinct and went with his feeling of, oh, look at her, this is an Indian American, I don't know, maybe culturally she was raised not to challenge authority, not to speak up. I don't know, she's really demure. How are we going to be able to accomplish things? If he had went with his gut of telling him all these concerns and not had given me the role, that role actually did a lot for me in my career, in terms of giving so much more exposure to senior leaders in the organization. I just think about how his one, bias how it could have affected my entire career. And
Completely.
the ramifications are huge. And all because of the labeling that typically Asians and South Asian people get of being demure, not vocal. Maybe they're not, able to hold leadership positions because of those reasons, right? Those are the common labels that Asians and South Asian like me, we receive is that, oh,
Right.
for leadership, you have to be vocal and assertive, and you may not be all those things because you were raised to not challenge authority and to keep your mouth shut. Right. So
Right.
there could have been a whole host of ramifications. And wow, just remembering how I felt in that moment is really
Yeah,
bringing back all
absolutely.
those
Well,
feelings.
stereotypes are powerful. And,
Yes.
part of the reason the researchers think consistently studies find that imposter syndrome feelings are highest amongst Asian Americans. And
Hmm.
also Bain just did a study where they found the group within corporations who felt the least sense of belonging were Asian American men, followed by Asian American women. So when you add in stereotypes, and here's where systemic bias does come in, the so-called model minority, ever
Hmm.
striving, ever excelling, that adds that extra pressure onto the Asian community, that other folks don't have.
Oh yeah, I feel it almost every day. If I didn't admit that, I would be a complete true fraud. The fact
Yeah.
that I know being an Asian American, how I must represent to people, oh, we can rely on her. She'll always be dependable. We know that her work ethic is very strong and high. And yes, it is. But because I want it to be, and certainly my
Right.
my parents' upbringing and raising of me all, influenced that. But I don't want that to be, hey, we're going to judge you at this level and you have
Mhm.
to go up from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure you're familiar with a concept called stereotype threat, but your listeners may not
Yes.
be. Claude Steele at Stanford University and Jason Aronson at Cornell University pioneered a concept called stereotype threat. And there's since been dozens and dozens of studies confirming it. And what they found is the fear of confirming a stereotype causes stress, which impacts performance. And it's
Mhm.
counterintuitive, but the more accomplished you are, the more the effect showed up. So, for example, they would give undergraduate students a math exam. Just adding a checkbox for gender, and I'm quite sure it was a binary choice when they did that, was male, female. The scores of the female students, of course, they went down because it reminded them, oh, yes, girls can't do math. When they
Yeah.
added a box for race, the scores of the Asian American students went up because it reinforced that supposedly positive stereotype about being good at math. So you
Yeah.
have to factor in societal aspects.
Exactly. And so you referenced the HBR article, and you were right. It did come out 3 years ago now. Stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. But one thing I do want to touch on, the obviously the authors are exploring in that article how imposter syndrome is designed as a way to control women, and they further go on to add that imposter syndrome directs our view towards fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. So to
Mhm.
that end, what would you say, or what are your thoughts about how organizations, or even everyone who's listening, all of our listeners, how can they fix the places where women work so we can stop misdiagnosing women with imposter syndrome, especially for people like me, women of color?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big advocate of working on both. I completely agree. We shouldn't be trying to fix anybody. And unfortunately, confidence, forget imposter, but confidence has become a controversial issue because women often don't get promoted because they're told that they don't project confidence like the way men project confidence. They don't have that executive presence. So it's all kind of tied up in a bunch of other stuff there. So I wrote an article in 1986. You can find it on the website. It was the cover art of the Executive Female magazine. and it gave like 16 recommendations for organizations for things that managers and organizations need to do to look at what assumptions are being made within the organization. Are we setting up women to fail? I mean, so there's a whole list of things, including, daycare, and I didn't call them ERGs, but setting up systems of support for people. So absolutely, organizations need to take a look at the ways in which they might fuel self-doubt, not just in women, but in other populations as well. But also at the same time, there's a wonderful organization in New York called Go Beyond Barriers. They're all about that middle rung that's broken in middle management and helping women get through that. And pretty consistently, the question they ask through this kind of program they go through is, before they start it, is, what do you hope to leave behind at the end of this experience? And it's like 94% say self-doubt. And this is all women. So I also think we shouldn't disregard the fact that it continues for all kinds of reasons. You can have the best organization in the world, but I think that there's ways that we also have been socialized or what have you, where confidence continues to be an issue for women. Not that there is the myth of the ever confident male, but I do see it more of an issue for women tend to hold back.
Right. Oh my gosh, there's so much there that we can go off of. Thanks for that referral. We'll definitely include that in the show notes. Given the plethora of these false narratives, what do you think the impact will be long term on people and in organizations if we're not addressing this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing, like, in social media, a lot of gaslighting. So whether it's women or women of color, if they bring it up, they're often like shut down and just, like, it's not real. And people are saying, I'm going to take it out of my vocabulary, and it's not serving. I mean, the research shows that a lot of people of color, there's high rates. And one of the arguments, I just want to say in that article, what they say is that the women of color couldn't resonate because the study was done with white women. Number one, it wasn't a study. It was observations of women who were in therapy or in personal growth groups who just happened to be there. And that's who was at the university at the time. Right. But, a woman of color, a psychologist, pointed out to me recently, she said, that's true for depression, for anxiety. All original research on those issues started with white folks. But we would never say, we're not going to talk about depression in the Black community or anxiety in this community because it was done with white folks. And again, there's been massive research on people of color. So I think organizations, to me, this is a business issue, that there's costs and consequences for individuals, but it impacts organizations as well. It has an impact on retention. People with imposter feelings are less likely to do career planning. They're more likely to job hop, to kind of outrun the no talent patrol. It affects advancement, and these companies spend a lot of money on HiPo programs aimed at high potentials. Often women, there's some big companies in Europe that have as a target to have 50% women in senior management in the next few years. So it affects advancement. It affects health and wellness because there's higher levels of burnout from folks overworking, over preparing. It affects productivity because there's more procrastination, more perfectionism, more focusing on, spending a lot of time on things that don't really matter to do it perfectly, when like half-ass is better than no-ass. Like, good enough, get the memo out, nobody's going to die. Don't spend 3 hours writing this memo.
Right.
And innovation, if you're the person who's not speaking up in a meeting, you're not sharing ideas, you're not taking risks, that's going to have an impact on innovation. So there's absolutely an incentive for companies to look at this issue.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about there points to psychological safety and cultures in workspaces. It's like, have a culture of learning, have a culture of it's okay to make a mistake, and like, you can speak up, you can share your ideas, because as we've already discussed, a lot of women hold back from doing that. And that's, based around that systemic bias that we've kind of looked into
today.
So Awesome. Thanks so much, Valerie. In your work, you developed the 5 imposter competence types, which I don't know. I mean, it's across the internet in lots of spaces. I personally found these extremely helpful in understanding my own version, or maybe even versions of imposter syndrome. But we do see a lot of bastardization of these across the internet. People referring to them as archetypes, for example, is one, sometimes even recreating their own versions, which are inaccurate when you consider, you develop these based on your actual research that you have done, and that's where they originated from. So can you talk us through the 5 types and clear up any myths that you see around the misrepresentation of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. They're not personalities. They're not archetypes. If you Google what are the 5 types of imposter syndrome, and there's like 3 million searches. And often people don't even know the origin. So so the misinformation gets spread because they just read the last article and it continues. So let me just tell you quickly how I came up with them. There's a lot of research that shows a strong connection between imposters phenomenon and perfectionism. That's been proven, and it makes perfect sense. But as I was out there doing workshops, I used to give people an exercise to come up with the unrealistic, unsustainable imposter workbook. In other words, fill in the blank. If I was really intelligent, capable, competent, I should, or I'd never, or I'd always, I'd always know the answer. I'd never make a mistake. I should do everything perfectly. And people would just fill these flip charts. They get into small groups, and I would collect them. And there was hundreds of these shoulds and nevers and always. And I started noticing patterns. And the pattern was, even though everyone who experiences imposter syndrome misrepresents, distorts, exaggerates what it means to be competent, we don't all do it the same way. And even though many people do identify with the perfectionist, not everybody did. So I came up with these 5 competence types. The first one is the perfectionist, right? And that often is the highest if you do a poll. So that's the person who, their understanding of competence, how they measure their own competence, is performing perfectly, flawlessly every single time. 99 out of 100, they would think of as failure. Some small typo, or they forget to make a point in a presentation, some minor point, and they will beat themselves up because they want it to be, kind of Academy Award winning every single time. But again, not everyone resonates. So there's also the next one is the expert. It's the knowledge version of the perfectionist. So for this person, it's not so much about the quality of their work. It's not that that's not important, but for them, it's about the quantity of knowledge and information that they know. And they often feel like they can never know enough. So this is, there's always like one more book to read, one more class to take, one more certification, one more degree, this endless pursuit of the end of knowledge. Or the person who doesn't go for a promotion because they still feel like they're not ready, like they don't know enough, they don't have enough experience. So the misconception there is sometimes that gets described as that they are an expert. And in reality, they may be, but that's not what it doesn't mean they think they're an expert or they are. It's mean that they're measuring their competence based on the quantity of knowledge and information that they know. The next one is the natural genius. And again, this gets misrepresented as, oh, you've always been a little genius and you always were smart. Like, I don't know that, and they don't either. So it doesn't mean you are a genius. It doesn't mean you think you're a genius. What it means is somehow you got it into your head that if you were really intelligent, capable, competent, this wouldn't be this hard. The fact that it takes you a while for your business to be profitable, for example. The fact that it takes you a while to understand something or master or get good at something, public speaking, for example, or negotiating or whatever it might be, leadership, in your mind proves you must be an imposter because you're measuring competence based on ease and speed. You expect to step into a new role, a new promotion, a new job, and just like hit the ground running and pick it up immediately. And when there's a lot of anxiety, you think it must be me, like if I was really smart. The fourth one is the soloist. That's the person who, as it sounds, they think they have to do everything themselves. If they got coaching, mentoring, group effort, team effort, they discount their contribution. And the fact that they might need to ask for help in their mind, proves they must be an imposter because a really competent person wouldn't need any help.
Yeah.
And the last one is the superhuman, and they are holding themselves to a very high standard on all aspects of their job. So, you know, scientific discovery and leadership, or big picture strategic planning and very detailed execution. When in fact, very different kind of skill sets were probably more stronger in one than another, but they expect to be very high caliber in all of them simultaneously. And often, especially for women, we also expect that outside of work to also be the perfect parent, partner, house looks great, we look great, and kind of make it all look easy all at the same time. So those are the 5 competence types.
Yeah, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, don't we, to perform and hit these really high standards. Everything you said about the natural genius definitely resonates with me. That is so my type. It's like you were talking about me.
I know. I thought she was talking about me when she talked about the superhuman. I was like, where do I raise my hand?
Valerie, I'm interested to know, when you were doing this research, which one was the one that resonated most with you, or one that you felt like was when you felt you had imposter syndrome? What was your type?
Probably initially it would have been so I didn't come up with that research till many years later. That was not part of my original thinking or research. So when I was a doctoral student, that's when I did my initial research. It would have been the expert, because you feel like you never know enough as a doctoral student. There's always one more paper to read, one more, it's like you just never feel like you know enough. And guess what? You don't, and you never will. Like that's the kind of shift, the reframing that we have to do. But in many ways, I think, humble realist thinking is also entrepreneurial thinking. It's about having a realistic understanding of competence, a healthy response to failure, mistakes, setbacks, constructive feedback, which of course feels like criticism to us, and to understand that a certain amount of fear and self-doubt is just part of the achievement journey. Because we confuse and conflate competence and confidence. We think if I was really competent, I'd feel confident 24/7. And my message is always like, good luck with that.
Yeah, not possible. Yeah, your work on imposter syndrome has been so helpful for me as someone who I didn't really know how much imposter syndrome had been affecting my life until I started working with you and understanding it on a deeper level. And so it's really important for us to clear up these myths and kind of debunk the fake news out there that is actually the fake news, as it were.
Can I just bring this kind of full circle just for a minute? Because we were talking about the stop telling women they have imposter syndrome and systemic bias. And I believe that if magically racism, sexism, classism, ableism, ageism, if all that went away tomorrow, if the family messages went away tomorrow, if it being stronger amongst STEM or students, if all of that went away tomorrow, but we kept these unrealistic, unsustainable notions of competence, we held on to these unhealthy response to failure, mistakes, and so on, imposter syndrome would remain. So it's important to look at all the external things, but to me, the core where the work needs to be done, and organizations can help with that. Organizations can help. Organizations sometimes pressure people to be perfectionists, or they pressure people to know everything. And so they can reinforce it as well.
Absolutely. Well, Valerie, this really has been amazing to chat with you about such an important topic, especially for our listeners. Can you share with us some final tips and strategies that our listeners can take away from today's episode?
Yeah, I would say, to keep in mind that this is not all about you, right? That there are costs and consequences, not just for you, but also for your organization, or I would say for the world, that truly everybody loses when bright people play small. So the 3 core tools are to normalize imposter syndrome, to reframe competence, failure, etc., and to keep going regardless of how you feel. And what I mean by that is, don't wait until you feel 100% confident. You have to change your thoughts first, even though you don't believe the new thoughts, the humble realist thoughts, but then act like, how would somebody act who really did believe they had the right to make a mistake or have an off day? And then over time, let the confidence catch up. Because so often, like, we want to read a book or take a class on imposter syndrome. We want to start feeling like an imposter and then like an hour later not feel like an imposter. And it's just not how it works. Feelings are the last to change.
Yeah.
Right.
You have to practice. That's what I tell my clients all the time. You kind of got to layer that confidence up over time with the small steps. And, you know, confidence comes from taking action. You have to be willing to try. You can't wait to be confident before you act. So you've actually got to take that action and push yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
Valerie, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us today on the Leading Ladies Who Lunch podcast to debunk the myths and misconceptions about imposter syndrome for our listeners. Do you want to let the listeners know how to connect with you, or how they can kind of find you?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. I've had the domain impostersyndrome.com since 1995. So you should be able to find me there.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Valerie. We've really learned a lot, and yeah, it's been wonderful.
Yes, thank you so
Thanks
much,
to both of you.
Valerie.
Thanks, Cece.
All right, awesome.